Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our March 25th Advanced Topics in Strengthening Youth and Young Adult Peer Support. Today, we're going to be talking about crisis planning and postvention. So we're really going to focus on what is it that you're doing in order to prevent crisis? What does safety planning look like? Then what do you want to do if a young person is having a crisis, and what might follow-up look like, both for the young person and for yourself as a provider. Briefly, before we hop in, we just always like to introduce the MHTTC network. We are in Region 10, that's that pretty little brown region up at the top, and we represent Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska. If you are not in our region, I really encourage you to look at the MHTTC website, take a look at the maps and things in your area, and see what sort of technical assistance can you access from your region. This is just a brief overview of some of the folks who are our leaders in the MHTTC Region 10, Lydia and Christina at the University of Washington. And you can also access their information on the MHTTC website. This is just a little bit of what our roles and our goals are in the Mental Health Technology Transfer Network. Really, we want to make sure that we are promoting evidence-based practices for youth and young adult mental health, school-based practices, foster alliances among culturally diverse practitioners, and make sure that we're bringing accessible and really valuable trainings to your areas. Something that's heavily valued in the MHTTC network is affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language. So we want to make sure that the language that we're using is really person-centered, strength-based, and trauma-informed. I encourage all of you, if you find that myself or any of our co-trainers might be using language that can be improved upon, please feel free to call us out. If we find that there might be some non-affirming language, we'll go ahead and send you a private message in the chat. So introductions. So my name is Caitlin Baird. I use she, her pronouns. And right there on the left is a picture of me, my dog Polo, and my cat Jude, who do sometimes make guest appearances in these webinars. I am a research assistant and trainer with the Pathways Research and Training Center at Portland State University, and focus on projects that center on youth-driven practice as well as youth peer support. Prior to my time at Portland State University, I was a youth peer support specialist, working with young people in wraparound and in crisis-based settings. And I was a supervisor for youth peer support specialists who were supporting young people in wraparound, crisis-based settings, and in the community. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll really quick. Please tell us what your role is. If you do not see your role within the poll, please drop it in the chat. Looks like almost everyone has voted. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the poll. If anybody didn't get to participate, please share your role in the chat. Excellent. So it looks like we have a number of peer support specialists, great, including youth peer support specialists, supervisors, therapists, care coordinators, and program directors or administrators. And then in the chat, we have a number of diverse roles as well. So we have caseworkers, a state recovery services director, a teacher, awesome, project funders, that's great, manager of consumer affairs, a youth prevention specialist, a SAP assessor, and another certified peer specialist. That's excellent, everybody. Oh, and a crisis intervention staff trainer. Awesome. Well, I'm glad to have you all here. So our learning objectives for today, we're going to focus on proactive safety planning and supportive strategies, how to create safety plans and self-care with youth, and a better understanding of provider self-care as well, because it's important that we take care of ourselves when we're working with young people in crisis. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and break everybody out into breakout rooms, into small groups, and ask that you guys focus on these two questions. What are some challenges that you faced when it comes to supporting young people in crisis? And how have you introduced safety planning to young people in the past? So you'll have a few minutes to discuss this. And then when we come back to the larger group, hopefully some folks will be willing to share. Okay, you should get an invitation to your breakout room now. Welcome back, everybody. So does anybody want to share some of the discussion that was had in their group?
I'll be a pal, Caitlin. I'll share a little bit.
Thank you.
We had just a couple of ideas. One of the people in our group was introducing QPR within the program, school programs. And so that was kind of an interface for bringing up the discussion of safety plans and things like that. So that was, and she found that was a great way to introduce the topic. One of the other ones was using something like a tool like the wellness wheel to look at where there were gaps in individuals' lives, and using that as kind of a tool to introduce where you can fill in the gaps and fill in some of those safety issues. And I think that's kind of a nice one. One of the other comments was that just having the materials out and just the natural curiosity of youth and having them be able to see it and touch it and feel it and be able to ask questions about it can sometimes be just a nice gateway for it. And one of the other comments was, kind of the barriers to it was sometimes parents can be a barrier in that it's a tough topic for parents to deal with. And so sometimes that can be a distraction or something that gets in the way of building a safety plan.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is some of the challenges can not only come up with young people, but sometimes their support networks. It's a scary topic, right? So I love some of those ideas that were shared around how do you make it more normalized and more understandable and tangible for young people. Does anybody else want to share some of the ideas that came up in their group or some of the challenges? So it says here in the chat, we tried dual groups where the parent is in one and the youth is in the other and then brought together at the end. I think that's a good idea because sometimes the way that we're going to discuss safety planning with our young people is going to look different than how we're going to present it to the parents, right? And so we might want to have separate meetings where we're coming up with separate ideas and then coming together to collaborate. Anybody else want to share?
I can share. Can you hear me okay, Caitlin?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
I had shared this with my group, but there was an issue with my mic. But one of the challenges that I face a lot with crisis support and intervention with young people is that there are often a lot of different agencies and agendas that are attached to this young person. And so, especially if they're involved with DSS and DJJ and clinical therapists and just a bunch of different groups, we all have different ideas of what is best for the young person. And so oftentimes what they need to get through a crisis and then recover post-crisis is not priority. It's not centered in the crisis planning.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes you bring up a challenge, Whitney, that happens just in lots of planning with young people that we're working with, where maybe their needs are not prioritized over system needs, right? And I think that we see that in both crisis planning and beyond. And so today we're going to touch a little bit on how do we make sure that whatever plan we're coming up with is something that the youth is really actively solicited in, and a lot of their strengths are what's driving the plan. Okay, well, thank you for sharing, everybody. I think that those were some great ideas. And if anybody else wants to drop things in the chat, feel free. So when we're being proactive about safety and support and talking about crisis plans with young people, we want to make sure that we're learning about their strengths. So before we even bring up crisis planning, getting to know what our young people are passionate about, what motivates them, what their hobbies are, and who their natural supports are can be really important. And then these are things that we can pull together when we're creating a crisis plan with a young person. So here we have a link to a little learning tool. I'm going to go ahead and drop this in the chat as well at the end. Due to time, I think that I'm going to save it for later, but we will revisit it in a future consult call when we're talking about how to discuss strengths with young people. So we're going to have another breakout in a little bit. But in addition to learning about young people's strengths, which when we're doing that, we want to make sure that that's coming up in a natural way, right? We don't really want to approach a young person and say like, all right, we're going to create a list of strengths, because that can just seem really weird. We want to make sure that we're using open-ended questions, keeping it conversational, really just sort of chatting with the youth and learning about what it is that they feel passionate about and that's valuable to them. This is the same way that we're going to identify natural supports. If we come up to a young person, even explaining what natural supports are and asking about them, it can seem a little bit sterile and uncomfortable. So we want to make sure that we're just creating dynamic, natural conversation with a young person. And then that's how we are listening and learning about who those natural supports are. So natural supports can be anybody that the young person sees as somebody who is safe and important in their life. And this can include emotional support, tangible support, and informational support. Natural supports are people who are sustainable supports in a young person's life, right? So young people that we work with, we know have a lot of formal supports. This can be therapists, caseworkers, even us as peer support specialists. We want to make sure when we're identifying people who are a part of the crisis plan, that they are people who can be supportive, ongoing in the young person's life. So we're going to go ahead and go back into our breakout rooms, and I encourage you all to talk about what are some strategies that you can use to help young people identify natural supports in their lives. And I encourage you to think about, especially young people who maybe feel like they don't have a lot of natural supports, what is that conversation going to look like, and how can you help them develop that? Okay, you should get your room invitation now. Okay, looks like we're all back. Who would like to share some of the ideas that came up in your group?
I can share for group 6 if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you, Mariah.
Yeah. So we talked about just a couple kind of simple ways to have kids identify those natural supports. The one that I thought was the most fun from Diana was who are the most contacted for people in their phones.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talked about like if they lost their phone, who would help them call it over and over and over again to find it, or what 4 phone numbers would they want back like immediately.
Yeah.
So we talked about that. One thing that I do with some of my students is I'll have them anonymously write on a piece of paper who is an adult in the building that they trust and why,
Mm-hmm.
just to remind them that they do have those people. And then another thing we talked about was who do you choose to spend your free time with and why? And usually that leads to because, I trust them or they understand me or that type of thing. And then we can show them that they are one of their support people.
I love that. I love the phone idea. I think that that's super clever. But yeah, I think that those are all great ways to help them think about like who are people that I can trust and rely on. And also, I like those because natural supports don't always have to be people that like you're necessarily talking to every day or something, right? Like, but people that you just know are reliable and can be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Who'd like to go next?
While you were muted.
We would. I
All
think
right.
Barrington. Hi, I think Barrington would love to start.
Hello, fellow youth, adult peers, and supervisors, everyone. One thing I like to come with when I engage my peers, my youth, and anybody I work with, I coined it as childlike exuberance. So, I say again, childlike exuberance. You're stepping into their world to have an understanding from their perspective. If there's a youth that, likes to watch anime, I'm an avid anime watcher. I can discuss it 10 different ways back to Sunday. If they're a sports fan, we have some physical activities that I like to engage with them. I just engaged 3 of my peers in a game of basketball. We had a good conversation, talked about how they're feeling at home, some of their concerns, maybe being in this facility at their time in life and where they want to go in the future. And that was just off of some basketball shootouts, 2021.
Yeah.
So I really, if I could say, when I was hearing the discussions earlier, and I'm so happy to see so many youth and fellow peer specialists, not to exclude anybody, but I felt like in my head, this is a young person's game. If you're a young person coming up with ideas for the future of fellow young people, then you got the right mindset. And again, not to exclude the elderly or the older folks, you come with the wisdom, you come with the knowledge, of course, and we love to hear from you. But also don't underestimate the mind of the youth as well, and that goes for the peers we serve as well. They are very smart individuals, young men, women in between, LGBT community, and all the beautiful colors of the rainbow. They have a lot to offer, just as much as we have to offer them.
Absolutely. And I love that you bring up these ideas on like, how are we talking about these like tough topics with young people, but in their world, right? Like coming into it in my own experience as a young person who was a part of the mental health system, I was much more likely to open up to somebody who was just like kicking it with me and doing what I wanted to do rather than somebody who I had to go and meet in an office in like a sterilized environment, right? Because it feels like a little more hierarchical when that happens. It doesn't feel like you're really being, I don't want to say doesn't feel like you're not being listened to, but it feels like much more like a checkbox system than an actual like mutual relationship or something like that. So yeah, a lot of when I was working with youth, I would never meet them like unless they were in a facility where I had to go and visit with them. It was always out in the community because I think that that's where you're really going to have just natural dynamic conversations, and if you're listening, can learn about their natural supports, their strengths, their worries, things that you can use in any kind of a crisis and safety plan. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Does anybody else want to share some of the ideas that came up in their group? All right. Well, we're going to have more breakout sessions. I might just start randomly calling on some of y'all. So just, yeah, be ready. So in addition to identifying a young person's strengths and their natural supports, so we want to know what their triggers, vulnerabilities, and warning signs are. Again, the best way to identify a lot of this is through that natural conversation that you're going to be having. As it was just brought up, you know, you can be shooting hoops and somebody's going to bring up like some of the things that are going on with them at home. And that's where you're learning some of these things, right? Something that we want to keep in mind for our current times is certain young people or demographics are going to be more at risk of crisis with COVID-19. Not everybody has the accessibility to some of the supports or the services or even just the stuff that they like to do anymore. And there might be added anxiety just to certain things that are going on. There are also certain times, so things like holidays, anniversaries of traumatic events. Again, we all just experienced like the anniversary of COVID-19 blowing up our world, that are going to be more tricky, and it could be triggers for young people in crisis. You want to be able to help the young person identify their own warning signs. As a youth peer, something that I frequently did, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, and I encourage, you know, other folks can do this too. You don't have to just be a peer, but share a little bit about yourself. What are some things that you've experienced where you've had to identify like, oh, this is something that triggers me, or I feel activated in this situation, and then maybe how you handle it. I think a lot of the times we attach the word triggers or activation to like some really negative connotations. And so we want to make sure that we're normalizing those for young people. Nobody goes without triggers. And if somebody comes up and tells me that they don't have any triggers, I'm like, you're lying. Or they don't know yet, right? So you want to be able to have those conversations with young people and help them identify their needs. Again, work with your team and the youth to identify and support the young person in like normalizing needing extra support and reaching out to their natural supports as well as any formal supports that they might need. And then always checking in with young people between any like team meetings or formal things that you're doing. Make sure that you're communicating with them in between your one-on-one meetings. And make sure that like, obviously, if you know that there's a time of crisis, rather than avoiding that conversation, being open and upfront about it. So another breakout room, everybody. I'm going to put you in your rooms and I want folks to talk with each other about how are you maintaining contact with youth during COVID-19 and helping them to have some of these more difficult conversations and kind of like this weird world that we have set up. Okay.
Yeah, I do. One of the things that has changed for me since Rona is that my support needs to pivot. And with the kids these days, a lot of them are more prone to texting rather than calling. So with my adults, I tend to call to hang out, and with my peers, we'll spend all day texting, and that's great. I also have a peer that I play Animal Crossing with, and so we've really been called to be flexible and try to find new ways to engage. One of the stressful things though that I've encountered is that the internet is always available. And so I'm really struggling with putting in boundaries for when I can hang out with this peer. Because like I want to work on my island, at midnight by myself. I'm not on the clock right now. And so being able to kind of have those negotiations has been interesting, and it's stressful being constantly available. So I'm curious what other folks have to say about like supporting electronically and the like ability for your peer to just like find you at any time?
That's a good question. I know that something that I used to do, even like pre-Rona, was because yeah, calling a young person is like not even I don't pick up the phone. My voicemail box has been full since like 2017, you know, so I know that they're probably not going to pick up the phone either. But in order to reach some of them, especially those who maybe didn't have cell phones but only had internet access, our agency would let us create social media accounts that were specific for that agency. So I think like keeping our personal account and then our work account separate was super helpful in being able to set some of those boundaries. Also, I think that if we normalize with young people, like, hey man, sometimes I just like need a bit of a break, but let's play Animal Crossing from this time to this time, if that works, that's always helpful too. But it depends on the young person, right? Because sometimes that can be a tricky conversation. Does anybody else have any ideas around this?
So I would like to speak a little bit on this.
Thanks. I was gonna actually call you out, Mordecai, if you weren't gonna say anything, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is my specialty. This is what I do. So the context of my work has always been online. And so some things have changed a little bit with COVID in how we approach most of our youth as an organization. And I work with Youth Era. I was asking my group to kind of share that a little bit. So I'll just throw like a link in the chat. But essentially what we're doing right now is we're meeting youth on Twitch. And I don't know if y'all know what that is, but it's a streaming service. And so we have a few different youth peer support specialists who stream video games, and they talk about certain topics that relate to mental health in the stream and welcome everybody in, just make everybody feel special and loved and really seen. And then we have people in the chat that are super engaging. We have a few youth peer support specialists in chat as well to support youth if they have crises that they're going through. And typically we don't do that in the main chat. We just pull that off into a private message. And this essentially, it's kind of meeting a couple purposes. We are meeting the youth where they are, one, and two, we are incorporating distress tolerance skills with actually having productive conversations around mental health. Because sometimes these conversations can get really like anxiety inducing and stressful. But if you're watching a video game and laughing and having good conversation and feeling really met and seen by people, or you're playing video games yourself, then you're able to balance maybe some of the more stressful things that are happening in your life and talk about those with more ease. So yeah, that's kind of what we're up to.
Yeah, that's awesome. And please feel free to drop a link in the chat, Mordecai, because I know that it's pretty unique work and it's really cool. Anybody else want to share some of the ways that they've had to shift, especially during COVID?
Hello, this is Barrington again. Awesome, Mr. Mordecai. I loved everything you said, especially going with social media and today's gaming climate. I can speak from personal experience, you know, in my younger years, I had a 5-year-old that I was playing Pokemon with. I'm thinking, hey, 5-year-old, I got this game. I'm pulling out a level 80 Infernape. He comes with a level 100 Reshiram and a Zekrom, and it's game over for me. His parent came, he's like, how'd you have fun, son? I'm like, I just kicked his butt. I was like, and that scarred me from playing online ever again, you know, communicating wise and all that. But I said, at least he had fun and he was engaged even while his parent was away. Because you can know, sometimes when the parents are away, a youth could feel anxiety, a little isolation, but engaging them in our modern technology kept them in a calm, excited state. And again, I go back to that youthful exuberance. In personal time, when I was a patient myself, I had a youth peer specialist named Anthony Catlin, if I could shout him out. He engaged me on, again, Twitch, just as Mr. Mordecai said. and, you know, communicating with him over his gaming. I was like, hey man, how you doing? I see you're tuned in. I was like, oh, I just had a long day at work, man. I just needed to, you know, de-stress, you know, use some of my coping skills, but I was able to live through his coping skills, sharing coping skills. His is video game, mine may be video chatting or going online to watch YouTube videos. And he just happened to be in that intersection of coping skills where he brought his to the table, and we, you know, bonded over that. So I am a surveyor, or a good, how you say, a cheerleader, for lack of a better term, for these social constructs for our youth. But personally, in my own setting for work, we don't usually give out social media or information or personal information though. But amongst my own peer group, you know, outside of here, my own support group has greatly benefited my mental health as well. And that's why.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it's an easy way to meet young people where they're at, right? But I do think it's important, sort of as Troy was alluding to before, like we want to be able to meet them where they're at, be available, and set those boundaries for ourselves, right? So like, I do encourage folks, if you're using like social media and stuff with your young people, make sure it's a separate account so that when you need to like personally log off, you can do that. And I want to normalize, like sometimes there can be a lot of guilt felt around that. I know whenever like I didn't answer the phone at 3 a.m. if a youth was calling me, I would just feel like absolutely guilty and ashamed. We have to uncouple that, right? Because if we're constantly like on and in crisis mode, we're not going to be able to care for ourselves. And that means that we're not going to be doing the best for our young people. Which we do have a section on provider care today, but I'm thinking just for the sake of time, we're going to do that for like part 2 next month, because that can be its whole own thing, you know? And I think oftentimes, like sometimes at our workplaces, or maybe just even in our own minds, we're like, yeah, self-care is important. And we can like definitely talk that talk, but then when it comes to ourselves, we're real bad at walking that walk. So I think that we're going to do a whole thing on self-care next time. For providers. And we'll probably go into some of the basics of safety planning for young people too, since we only have about 5 minutes. But we want to keep in mind safety plans are unique. This is an individualized process. I know that a lot of agencies have their own templates for safety plans. Make sure that those can be edited based on what the youth wants, right? Like it doesn't have to be on whatever piece of paper it is. It needs to be something that can be adjusted to the young person. But some of the things that safety plans are going to cover are things like their triggers or their warning signs. What can they do to distract themselves? Coping strategies. What are things that they can do alone? Things that they can do with others? People that they can reach out to, and things that they can remind themselves in crisis. So this is why we want to be having those conversations up front with young people about their strengths, right? And then if necessary, crisis line numbers. One thing that a safety plan should not look like. A safety plan should not just say, call 911 or call the crisis line. It has to be more detailed than that. Can't tell you how many times I joined like a wraparound team and that was a safety plan. That's a big no-no. We don't want it to get to that point, right? So that's why you really need to be engaging with young people on like, what are the things that you can do that you enjoy that are going to take you out of crisis mode? Obviously, one idea that's already been brought up that I think a lot of young people share is video games. You know, I know that the big one for me, I've got my dog over here licking his butt, you know, it's walking my dog. Like you really want to make sure that you're coming up with like, what are the accessible things that they can get to in the moment that are going to take them out of crisis. So again, safety plans can be creative. I had a young person who for their safety plan, we ended up basically painting a mural that was hung up in her bedroom. It doesn't need to be like this really sterile, boring, kind of like just a clinical feeling template. I think a lot of times too, when our safety plans look like that, it almost feels, and I know that this is never the intention, but it almost feels like punitive, right? Or a little bit shameful. And you don't really want to look at it. We need to have the safety plan be something that the youth wants to address, that they want to look at. They don't want to be carrying around this piece of paper that's going to make them feel bad, right? So it can be artwork, it can be journaling, it can be poetry. Like I said, I did a mural with one of my youth. So see how a young person really wants to engage in A, having this conversation, and B, make it fun, creating something. And then again, who do they want to share it with? And if they're really getting creative about it, generally young people are more eager to share it. I had young people, when they were really creative with their safety plans, they wanted to present it to the team rather than just kind of like wanting to ignore it and leave it over there. Also, safety plans need to be adjusted over time. Sometimes young people might be meeting new natural supports, gaining new hobbies, and obviously with things like the pandemic, you want to make sure that things are adjusted so that it's actual things that they can access. And really quick, I really love this comment from Whitney. Whitney said, it's important to model setting boundaries with young people too, in relation to our previous conversation. And the more that we share why it's important to set those boundaries, the more normalized it becomes. Totally. And it shows to young people like, you can set boundaries with people and that's okay, right? I think a lot of young people just sort of naturally feel like they have to like be all the things all the time for all the people. And so if we model for them that, you know, we don't have to do that, then I think it makes it easier for them to be like, no, I'm allowed to take some me time and set some boundaries too. So we have 1 minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and split this into a part 2 for next month, where we're really going to focus on primarily provider care, but some creative ideas for safety planning and self-care. Before we wrap up, I'm going to go ahead and drop an evaluation link in the chat. You will also get this in a follow-up email, but it's super helpful for us if you can just go do it's a pretty short evaluation of our consult calls so that we can learn more about how to better serve you all. So thank you so much for joining, everybody. And you'll get an email about our next webinar. You already know what the topic is going to be. If there's anything else that you want to cover, please feel free to shoot me an email, and please do fill out that evaluation. Take care, everyone.